Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Julia Rose. She's a seasoned journalist the host of Top of Mind, a podcast dedicated to helping anxious people and news avoiders engage in important topics in an empowering and thoughtful way. With over 20 years of experience in radio journalism, she's reported for NPR local stations in Salt Lake City and Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as networks shows including Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Top of Mind was created to address the growing number of Americans who avoid the news due to its often depressing and divisive nature. Julia's mission is to help listeners become better citizens and kinder neighbors, tackling tough topics in a manner that fosters empathy and constructive dialogue. Each episode aims to challenge listeners to help them feel more connected and empower them to engage productively in their communities. We welcome Julie to the podcast. Well, Julie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, Keith. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm honored to have you on. I love talking to you, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. It's a very timely topic as we try to figure out how to deal with the anxiety in this really, really interesting time that we live in.
You are not wrong. Absolutely.
We're all consuming a lot of anxiety and news.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to want to just sort of bury your head in the sand and sort of hope that things work their way out and you can resurface in another 6 months. I don't know.
That's my goal.
We'll dive into that because I definitely can relate to that impulse.
And my wife and I, we wake up in the morning and we first talk about, what did you hear in the news? And you try to, my goal, the funny thing I did when I set up my new phone was I decided to set it up so that I had news from both sides of the aisle and my phone just can't handle it. It kind of blows up so it doesn't know what to send me, which is kind of funny actually. Because I was like, the truth is somewhere in the middle or not at all, but it can't just be one side of it. So we're going to get into that, but I'm looking forward to talking to you about how you have helped, how you've navigated through some of that. I had another guy on who had to set up a website to do that too. So it's kind of a theme the last couple podcast episodes of where do you get news from that you can trust?
A lot of people are working on the problem right now, so I'm happy to be part of the conversation.
Great. I love to ask my guests this question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
If it's okay with you, I'm going to talk about professional advice.
Because,
of course, also there's, personal advice and faith-related advice. But when it comes to professional advice, and this actually was something that I picked up, not from someone I know personally, but someone I greatly respect, and I've really followed her work, and it's been a real inspiration for what I'm working on right now. So her name is Amanda Ripley. She's a journalist and author of an amazing book called High Conflict. And she has talked a lot about the importance of complicating the narrative. So the advice is, as a journalist, I should look to complicate the narrative. Now, it's something that is counterintuitive and doesn't come naturally to a lot of journalists who crave, I think we all crave simplicity. I want you to tell me what's the truth and what's not the truth. I want you to tell me who's on this side and who's on that side. Sometimes I even, as a consumer, want you to tell me who are the good guys and who are the bad guys here, right? Like, just help me understand this complicated world that we live in. And the thing that was so earth-shattering for me about this advice of complicating the narrative is that I, as a journalist, and many, many journalists, have allowed ourselves to be lured into trying to simplify at all times. This is complicated. I need to boil it down. I need to simplify things. And what too often that results in is painting an overgeneralized perception of the issue. And the reality is that people are complicated, and so are these big issues that we deal with. And so, for example, I have frequently been in the situation of putting together a story. I worked for years. I've been a radio journalist for 20 years. The first half of my career was doing public radio reporting for NPR stations. The last half here, I've been doing daily live radio, and now I'm doing long form podcasting. And I have frequently been in the situation of interviewing someone who starts to say, they're contradicting themselves a little bit. They're like, well, yes, I feel this way about this issue, but I also kind of see this thing, but sometimes it's hard for me on this angle. And I can feel my frustration start to mount because I'm like, well, just take a side, don't be so equivocating, like just pick it. Be clear with me. Don't sort of like dance around. That felt like weakness to me. It felt like unnecessarily complicating or trying to sidestep and not allow themselves to be pinned down. And then I would go into the reporting of the story, and I would inevitably end up making them sound a little more certain of the issue than they actually had been. Not that I was misrepresenting them, but if at some point in the interview they had said something that was contradictory, well, that was something that was more likely to end up on the cutting room floor if I had to tighten the episode, right? Because I know that listeners are going to be confused by that, or that's a complicated concept that they're introducing, and I need to provide simplicity. And anyway, so what was mind-blowing to me about this recommendation to complicate the narrative was that I had been part of the problem. I had been contributing to the way that the media covers important stories can actually lead people to think that the world is more clearly divided into good guys and bad guys, into one side and the other side, that the battle line is clear. And that leads us to have all sorts of inaccurate concepts about what the other side, quote unquote, actually thinks or believes. And then we start to build up all of these assumptions and emotions around that side. And that actually contributes to us separating from one another and retreating into our corners and fueling our own narratives in our mind about how we're right and they're wrong and here are all the reasons why, rather than being curious and open to the fact that things are complicated and there's a lot of messiness in between and people are contradictory. And so complicate the narrative has become one of my mantras to often look for when someone says something that is a little contradictory. I lean into that. I want to ask more questions, and I want to make sure that I'm including that in my stories and my podcast episodes, because that's where we start to allow people to turn on their own curiosity and be open to building the kind of bridges that you and I are both really interested in.
I love that. And it makes me think about just real life in general, or even myself. Mm-hmm. I am not on one side always of a topic. And because there are complexities. When I'm dealing with, like, mm-hmm. as a pastor, when I'm dealing with a family situation, I'd love to go in and say, okay, this person's right, that person's wrong. But that's not how it works out. There are extenuating circumstances in most situations where that's not 100% correct. And I can't mm-hmm. just kind of walk in and tell you this is whose side you should be on, because there's so many other pieces that you don't understand unless you take the time to listen, to know that if you give me a straight answer, I'm a little more suspicious, because it can't be that black and white, because life isn't that black and white. Life is in the gray. Yeah. And so if you give me a black and white answer, I'm going to tend to not believe you, because it's just not that simple. Like you just pointed out, there are complex situations on both sides. Like I was just talking to a podcast guest who was talking about what's happening, like, for example, in the Middle East. And we love to just kind of give, well, here's who's right and here's who's wrong. I'm like, yeah, but there's a lot of nuance in that story. And I've been listening to both sides now, and I'm kind of going, I can't figure out how you solve this. And so I don't know how we just go in and say, this is the answer and this will solve all the problems. So you're right. You have to deal with the complexity of a situation, the complexity of a problem, to realize that there is so much more there that you don't understand, and you can't just simply say this is the answer. Although we like it, because I grew up in the 70s, so I liked all my problems being solved in a 30-minute sitcom. But that's not how life is.
Exactly. Or an after school special, right? That tells you, hey, unequivocally, this is what will happen to your life if you engage in this particular behavior. Yeah, I know. And here's the thing, for me, it's really forced me both as a news consumer and a journalist, and also in the interactions I have in my daily life with people I differ with, to realize that I'm a clinically anxious person. I've been on anxiety medication basically my whole adult life. Part of what triggers my anxiety and causes me to want to steer clear of really engaging with complicated topics is that I'm afraid that I'm going to find out that I don't have all the answers, or I'm going to learn something that is going to sort of shake my worldview a little bit, point out to me that maybe I've done harm in some way, or that I've held an opinion that is actually causes harm to some people, or all of these like stuff that I can't control. And it feels safer to me to sort of stay in my little simple bubble where I know everything there is to know, and and the people that are like me say I'm right, and that feels good to me. I've realized that because of anxiety and fear, I've been inclined to want to stay and to get frustrated when somebody stands in front of me as a complicated human being. But if I flip the switch, the lens, right, and I start to say things that are a little contradictory, I want to be extended the grace to be a complex person with contrasting views, who's working things out, and also who might both agree and disagree with an issue, because that is far more common than clear, unequivocal, I'm all in or I'm all out on a specific issue. So yeah, it has been a humbling experience to me to realize the ways in which I've allowed my own anxiety and fear to sort of perpetuate this idea that simple is better. And now, as I start to try to think about noticing how my emotions, how I get really frustrated when I feel like someone is being hypocritical. Like growing up, if you were hypocritical in any way, like if you espoused one thing but did another thing, like for me, I was like, Jesus says hypocrites are bad, and I agree. That really, really bugs me. And so I would just get this righteous indignation, and I'd be like, how dare you? And there's nothing of value in you, and you can't be trusted in anything that you say, right? Like way out of proportion reaction. And I realize now how much of that I've like allowed myself to program myself in these reactions, so that when I'm having a conversation about a complex topic and someone says, here's how I feel about this issue, but I'm also troubled about this aspect of it, or I also think that maybe my position isn't fully right, and I'm like, you're a hypocrite. I want to immediately sort of assign all of that to you, rather than saying, that's interesting, tell me more about that. Like leaning into the curiosity, allowing it not to make me angry or frustrated, not to feel afraid, which is my typical, which feels like my natural response, but to get curious and say, wow, I love it. That's complicated. Let me hear more. Tell me more about that. But that's where I can start to have actually productive conversations, is when you get curious about the contradictions and the complexity.
I love that. And, I have that same issue. I think my big thing is authenticity. So when you seem to be hypocritical, you're not really being authentic. Just say it like it is. Tell me the truth. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't waffle on it. But I just don't understand that everything is not as cut and dry as I like it to be. And so I've had to learn to live in the nuance of life sometimes, and realize that people aren't always sure of the direction they're going, or even the stances that they take. But the hypocrisy does drive me crazy. So I have to kind of step back and go, okay, is it hypocrisy, or are they trying to figure something out? And so I'm learning to give more grace when I don't think that they've actually figured it all out yet.
Exactly. I'm still very annoyed if you say one thing and do something completely the other, like I'm not cool with that. But when it comes to these complicated, if I'm honest with myself, I've done that before as well. And if my justification is, well, it's complicated, then I'm like, of course it is. And so it must be that way for other people too. So yeah, it really is trying to feel like I can trying to practice a more gracious response to people. Yeah.
I'm curious about your journey as a journalist. What inspired you to start your 2 podcasts now? You have Top of Mind, another one you just started. So what led you on this journey to do that?
Yeah. Well, okay. The very short answer is that I started in public radio after I had another career for about 8 years, and it really wasn't doing it for me. I got into radio reporting, and I just found my home, and I loved it. So I reported for a couple of public radio stations in Salt Lake City and in North Carolina. I was in Charlotte. And then about 11 years ago, my parents were needing some help and in my hometown of Provo, Utah. And I just knew that I needed to go back and be able to do that for them. I'm a woman of faith. It was like a lightning bolt from heaven. I was, without a doubt, this was a prompting that I had that I needed to go do this. And I really wanted to be able to do this for my parents. So I came back to Utah and kind of left my public radio career and didn't know really what was going to happen after that. But, and I had loved the ability to report on complex issues and take complicated ideas and be able to help explain them in a way that people could understand. And I was really good at boiling things down, right? Which is not a bad skill. But again, it's sort of like you can go too far, and I started to notice how that became my focus, right? So anyway, I came back to my hometown of Provo, Utah, and just around that time, about 11 years ago, the local university, my alma mater, Brigham Young University, was starting a 24-hour satellite radio station, and they needed content. And they didn't have any journalists on the team. And I said, well, would you like maybe a news talk show? Like, I'm not a pundit. I'm not going to get on and tell people my hot takes, because I don't really think that's not the kind of radio I want to listen to, but I'd love to do nuanced conversations, in-depth conversations. And heck, let's do it live on the radio. Why not do it without a net? Exciting, right? So for 7 years, I did that every day live on the radio for 2 hours, Monday through Friday. And the show was called Top of Mind. And BYU Radio still exists. You can hear it on Sirius XM channel 143. I did more than 10,000 interviews during that time. 6 a day, roughly, 15 minutes often, sometimes slightly longer interviews. And towards the end of that time, we were kind of in the middle of the pandemic, and I just started to experience what I think a lot of people can relate to, which was I just was burned out on the news. And it caused a real professional crisis for me, because you can't be a journalist and not consume the news, right? So I was really embarrassed about this. I was kind of hiding it. I went from being the kind of person that my alarm clock was the local radio station. I would get in the car and I was listening. I didn't have a shower radio, but I would crank up my radio really loud when I'd get in the shower so I could hear everything. I wouldn't miss a thing. And I was constantly listening to the news all the time when I was doing housework and all weekend long, right? I was absolutely absorbing it. And I started just avoiding it and going back to work on Monday, sort of dreading having to plug back into the news machine. And it was around that time that, again, here's another name. So Amanda Ripley, that same journalist who had talked about complicate the narrative, I hadn't encountered her yet at this point. But I read an article that she had written in the Washington Post where she said, I'm a journalist and I'm tempted to avoid the news. I'm a news avoider. And I was like, oh, I'm not the only one. So that was a relief. And I learned from her article, which was in the Washington Post, that 40% of Americans, almost 38% of Americans, avoid the news sometimes or often. And sometimes it's entirely, sometimes it's for periods of time, sometimes it's specific topics. And that really spoke to me. Maybe since I'm not the only one, why are they avoiding it? And I bet you can imagine it's a lot of the same reasons that I don't know, that you probably feel inclined occasionally to avoid the news, like we were discussing, right? It's depressing. It's overwhelming. It's biased. I don't know what to trust. I felt all of those things as well. It was fueling my anxiety, making me feel less mentally well. But also hiding from the news didn't feel right, because I feel like I need to be engaged with important issues in the world in order to be the kind of person I want to be. A kinder neighbor, a better citizen, a more effective advocate for what matters to me. So I felt like I was really trapped, and realizing that I wasn't the only one came right at the same moment that our bosses at BYU Radio invited us to take our daily radio shows and turn them into weekly podcasts. And they said, what would you do? Reinvent yourself. What is the kind of podcast that you would like to do? And I said, well, it would be something that I would like to consume as a person who feels inclined to avoid the news, but also really cares about important issues. I want to be able to hear perspectives that surprise me. I want to listen in a way that will allow me to see the complexity in an issue, see the nuance. I don't want hot takes. I don't want to have my emotions yanked around all the time by people yelling at each other. I want to feel optimistic. I want to feel empowered, but I also don't want good news. Of course, I like good news, but I'm not asking you to just have a podcast that's all about all the wonderful things that are happening in the world. I also, what I want is to really get into the nitty gritty of these complicated, controversial topics, but show me when people are working to solve those problems, show me that too. It can't just all be hopeless. It can't just all be conflict with no purpose to it. Show me the complexity. So we don't take a side. That's what Top of Mind became. We would take one issue each episode. We spend almost an hour looking for perspectives of people with personal stake in the issue we don't take a side. We want you to feel challenged no matter what your perspective is, to have that experience of having your mind opened just a little bit, feeling a little uncomfortable because something doesn't quite jive with your worldview and makes you kind of think a little more deeply, and come away feeling empowered in that that maybe there are solutions out there you want to get involved in, or maybe it's simply that now you realize this is more complicated than I thought it was. I'm actually going to think about this differently next time I vote, or I'm going to go to the website I'm going to find out what my congressperson thinks about this issue, because now there are a few more things I need to double check on. It's going to color the way and that for me feels empowered. When I feel like there's a next step for me, I know a little more about what I don't know, and I can go and I'm hungry for more information, or I feel like I have better clarity so that I can vote with more, have a better vote, express myself better in conversations. That's what empowerment is. So that's what we sought out to create, was Top of Mind. And then this new podcast is an offspring of that. It's called Uncomfy. It's shorter conversations where every episode I talk with one person about a time when they experienced feeling a little challenged by a viewpoint or by a conversation or by a situation. And instead of getting defensive or lashing out or running away like we tend to want to do, they chose to stay a little uncomfortable, to stick with that discomfort, to stay open and curious. And they tell us what it felt like, why it was challenging, how they chose to stay open, and why they're glad they did. So it's all kind of interconnected in this personal goal of mine to recognize that the world is complicated. I want to consume media that honors that complexity, but that also helps me understand how to better engage with the world and with my community.
I love that. As you were talking, I was trying to think about, as I listen to news, what about it creates in me anxiety? And what came to my mind was, not only is it the sense of hopelessness in the news reporting, but it's this push to, no matter which side I'm watching, is to hate the other side, to hate the other opinion. And it's just so much, they're the enemy, they're here to destroy you, that you walk away with this, like you just talked about, this sense of hopelessness versus, okay, that's one perspective. How do I check into that and see if that's true? And if so, how do I respond to it? What do I do about it?
Yeah.
My wife and I end up watching news, not only just locally, but around the world. So it's like you can go find bad news anywhere. And so if you're on the news all the time, you can find out what's happening in Great Britain, what's happening in France. You can find out the tensions that are there. And somebody once said, why news is so hard for us to stomach today is it used to be local. And now because of the internet, news is global. And you can see the pain and suffering all around the world. And you can walk away completely feeling hopeless and disjointed with life and just ready to give up because everything looks bad. Everything is on fire.
Yeah, that's a really insightful.
Right.
And so I think it's right. I think it's one of the things that's very disempowering and overwhelming. And unfortunately, a lot of local news has gone away because of the financial support that they used to rely on in the form of classified ads, and local advertising has been drained away by the internet, by Facebook and Google ads. And so that has led to a real challenge for local newsrooms. One of my first tips when people say, well, how can I engage with the news more productively? So I described for you how I wanted to create a product that would be part of the part of the more productive way of engaging with the news. But I have also deployed some very specific strategies in my own news consumption to make sure that I'm not just sort of getting swept away in the discontent and the fear and the anxiety and the frustration and the hopelessness. Because the truth is that I think it actually, what it really requires is a very intentional, mindful consumption of the news. A lot of news consumers, I think the majority of news consumers are what experts classify as passive news consumers, where you consume the news that shows up on your feed, that you overhear, that comes to your dinner table. There's a lot of that we allow the algorithms and our social circles to feed us the news, and it feels like we have this sense that we know what's happening in the world, but we're actually not. We're at the mercy of the algorithms and other people. And 9 times out of 10, what really comes to us from those sources is stuff that's not designed to allow you to see the nuance. It's not designed to help you feel great. It's designed to trigger big emotions of anger, outrage, frustration, fear, sadness. And so the first thing that I always say is we have to take control of our news consumption. And we have to do it mindfully. So I subscribed to a whole bunch of news outlets on social media, and I went and unsubscribed to all of them on Facebook because I don't want to just get whatever that news outlet, the algorithm is pushing me from that particular news outlet on any particular day. I just don't. And I also, anytime someone shares a news story on social media from within my feed, I'll clock it, but I won't dig into it. And I won't consider that part of my news consumption or let it send me down a rabbit hole. What I'll do is I'll leave the social media site and I won't click through in that link and I won't look at the comments. If this is something that I want to be informed about and not just have big feels about, then I'm going to go mindfully search to inform myself. And then the second thing is to do exactly what you were describing, that you and your wife consume from a range of sources, and you intentionally acknowledge the bias that exists, political bias or, local versus national or global, right? Like bias is natural. It's part of being a human. Every story is reported through a lens that includes the bias of the organization, the bias of where the story was reported from, the bias of that person's, own interests, bias related to a desire for simplicity, bias related to, wanting to get clicks. And so it kind of leans into the salacious conflict piece of it, right? There are all kinds of biases, including political biases, that can inform stories. And so broadening your range of sources is another really important way for us to kind of take control and make sure that we're not being swept away by one particular narrative. I have other tips too I'm happy to share, but I'll let you interject first, Keith, because I know that this is a practice that you've engaged in yourself.
No, I love that. And I love the idea, because right now I'm trying to figure out myself, how do I engage in the news in a more positive way? Because the problem is I run across is because most of the news is visual now. So you got YouTube channels and YouTube creators, and a lot of your news you get from there. And even with that, I started to see that there are common catchphrases, like, for example, the DNC just ended. And so everything was joy. And I'm like, okay, that's obviously went out as this is the talking point for this.
Yeah.
And the other one was...
You're a savvy consumer to pick up on that, right? Certain talking points, especially in political news, are a real thing. And if you're noticing things getting repeated over and over again, those have been specifically engineered. And we need to take that with a grain of salt, because it's an organization or a candidate trying to influence you, and they have an agenda, which is to get you to support them.
Right. And it cracks me up because one side's patriotism. And so patriotism and joy. And so you're sitting there going, I need to get down to give me the actual what you believe in and what you stand for. I don't want to be emotionally moved by news. And so I try to find as many different sources. But then you go down this rabbit hole of, by the time you get to the truth, you're so... For me, you talk about anxiety. I deal with that same issue myself. When I am sitting there consuming news and I'm so anxious, I have to turn it off because I'm depressed. I resort to music. I need music to just clear my mind and not think about anything I just read. And so I remember trying to go 24 hours recently with having no news because it just was wearing me down to the point I didn't even want to get up in the morning because it was just so much bad news. And I know a lot of people have just tuned out, and you're right, it's dangerous to tune out because then you're not really aware of when something is important you need to know. And so as a consumer, how do you, like you talked about, how do you find the news you need without news that will destroy your mental capacity, your mental ability to just function in a day-to-day society?
Yeah. What is it, Keith, if I can ask, what is it that feels like it destroys your mental capacity to function? Is it that it all feels so bad, or that it's confusing, that you don't know where the truth is, or that it's overwhelming? What is it?
It's kind of a combination because you don't know where the truth is. Because here's an example. So if you look at the presidential polling, you got one that says this can is up by 4. You have another that says this can is up by 4. And you know they can't both be true.
Well, why not? Why can't they both be true?
Well, they could be true. But you wonder
because
if they're
it all
true.
depends on how you ask the question and who you talk to. I think part of what I'm trying to point out here is that sometimes we're looking for what quote unquote truth, the complete, total, objective truth, as you know. But sometimes the questions that we're answering don't actually have an objective truth. I think when it comes to political stuff. So for example, you might be able, I think if you're wondering, well, who's winning? I think it's going to have to be a lot more complicated than just who's ahead, who's winning. We already know that polls can be influenced by timing, when those questions were asked, who answered the phone, whether it was done online or by phone, how they asked the question, and different, and each different polling outfit has a different sort of slant in terms of who's in their polling pool to begin with, right? So polling in and of itself is not an exact science. So I would argue that 2 polls can both be true, quote unquote true, in the world, within the question, the realm, the framework that they're asking the question. And so then it falls to us to ask. Now political news is especially challenging because a lot of times what we're being told is partly true, or it's a way of interpreting the same set of facts. So some things are absolutely objectively factual, right? You can look at what were the unemployment numbers as the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported them for a specific moment in time, and you can look at the trajectory and you can look at those numbers, right? But you're going to have one candidate who's going to tell you, I was great for jobs, and you're going to have the other candidate who would say, that guy was terrible for jobs. And they are both true, but that's because they're looking at different subsets of the data. You can make the data say anything. You can make a poll say anything. And I don't want to be so cynical about this that people feel like, well, nothing's true and everything's true. Because that's what the totalitarians want us to think. Like Hannah Arendt, who's a famous political philosopher, she looked at, what Stalin and what the Nazis were doing and came to this conclusion that there's this sneaky thing of telling you that there's no truth, but that everything could possibly be true. Right? That's how you sow chaos and apathy and lull people into this sense of just sort of like being ready to believe anything that can actually be totally false. Okay. So those are tools of people who want to deceive us intentionally. So what I'm saying here is that when you're looking for the truth, I think we need to redefine what we mean by the truth, because there are things that are factually true, but a lot of times you can take a list of facts and they don't tell you a lot, because the next question is, well, what do I make of this? All right, so the numbers were up and the economy was down and the GDP did this thing and then it also did this thing, right? Or, so does that mean that person was good or bad for the economy? It depends on what you value. It depends on which of those measures is most important. It depends on, so I don't think we can trust any political candidate or campaign or political ideologue to tell us the one and only interpretation of the facts. But there are ways to get a sense for who's trying to say what. So often what I find with what's challenging with political news in particular is that oftentimes, I trust but verify, and I start with a bit of skepticism at every instance. And if a candidate is saying, if If somebody is telling me something that they did or that someone else did, I always start by thinking, okay, how does this make me feel? Does it feel like they're trying to tap into certain kinds of emotions? What is their agenda? The beautiful thing in political bias is that we know what the agenda is. It's to get you to support them and not the other side, right? So I have to be clear about the source of the information. And then I take all of that into consideration as I consume that story. So that I'm recognizing, all right, well, from this perspective, they're trying to get me to support them. Here's how they're shaping this story. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to look at an opposing political perspective and how they're reporting it. And I'm doing the same thing. And I'm noticing what are some of the common threads here. And from that, you can actually come to an objective set of facts. And you can see how both sides are interpreting that. And separating the facts from the interpretation, right? From the lens through which they are presenting those facts by what they want you to focus on as the consumer. And I will share one little secret that is often surprises people, but when I am embarking on a complicated topic that has a lot of history, so, Israel and Gaza, or immigration at the border, the US border, or border safety, or I don't know, economics, the economy, the US GDP, whatever, I will often start with Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia, once upon a time, 20 years ago, when we were tots, yes, it was a free-for-all. It's 20 years old now. It has begun to mature it has matured in some really important ways. And Wikipedia now has an entire community of moderators and standards committed to neutral presentation of information. And a lot of the most controversial and complex topics are actually locked. So not everybody, I can't just go on there and prank it, and say whatever I want to say. And anything that's said in Wikipedia also has to be substantiated by a link. There has to be an actual source. So you can go to Wikipedia, and it's a really great way for me on some of these issues like, okay, was this president good or bad for the economy? I'll go see if there's an article on Wikipedia about this. And there often is. And then I'll go through and I'll read, well, the left says this and the right says this. And here's this part down here where here are some of the basic facts. And here's what happened with the numbers at this particular moment that a lot of people think about or focus on. So Wikipedia is a great place to give me a base of knowledge. And then down at the bottom of the page, every claim is sourced. And so you have a list of links that I can then go to. I'm like, okay, so this is where they were sourcing what the right says about this. What is that source? Interesting. Well, that's a Fox News link, or it's a Washington, New York Post link, or whatever, right? A Washington Examiner link. I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to look and see how some of the other coverage of that issue has been covered in that particular, right? So it's a great way to give you a roadmap when you're feeling completely lost at sea. And that is one of the strategies that I use, especially when it comes to political news.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there was a source that you go to find truth or find different sides of the same. I think I found a website called 1440, and
okay. I'm so glad you mentioned. There are a bunch of people doing this.
They just give you straight news.
So 1440. Well, they also tell you what other sides are covering.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. So here's a couple of great resources when we're specifically talking about political news. So the 1440 is great. Well, all of these websites have in common, and their newsletters as well. I subscribe to their newsletters. Sometimes they're free, sometimes they're not, but I even pay for a couple of them because I find them really useful. So they have a team of journalists. The 1440 is great. The Flip Side is another one that's great. I also really love Tangle News. And what they do is they're very transparent about what they're trying to accomplish. And they're saying, look, here's the agreed upon set of facts about this particular issue. So they'll often take just one issue, an episode, per newsletter issue, right? They'll take one topic, whatever the big topic of the news is or whatever that day. And they'll say, okay, here are some agreed upon facts that existed, that this candidate was at this place at this time. And, he said these things according to the transcript. And this was what the response was from this place and this place. And so that's the issue, right? Okay, so they take whatever's agreed upon facts that you can fact check and that exists for sure. And then they'll say, here's what people on the left are saying. Here's what some people on the right are saying. saying. Here's what people who are kind of all around the place say. And so you're getting, and then they'll include links and sources. So you can very quickly see those lenses around that common set of facts. And I find that really, really useful as well. So for big issues of the day, you can go to one of those sites, and generally they're covering one of these issues. But if you're coming at something like honestly, I spent a lot of time on Wikipedia at the beginning of the Gaza-Israel conflict because I needed to get up to speed on some of the background, and it felt like diving straight into the breaking news was just like going over my head, and I couldn't take a breath. And so I needed to get some context, and Wikipedia was my first place, and it was very helpful. There is no such thing as the one true source that will give you just the facts, ma'am, and only the facts and no interpretation whatsoever. All right. It does not exist. And the bad news, Keith, is that means we have to do some of the work ourselves.
Yeah. All that hard work is just knowing.
It is. It is. But you know what? I find it empowering to know that, when I feel like there's warring, competing narratives, I know that those are competing narratives and that there's probably some truth in both. And I have a few concepts about, and I'm able to kind of set aside this, I don't know, this hopeless endeavor of trying to find that one true source. Okay. And so instead it becomes an exercise for me in understanding my own position on an issue and better understanding viewpoints that I struggle to comprehend. So then it becomes more about engaging with perspectives that challenge me rather than tell me the truth. Where's the truth? I want the truth.
So thinking about so many Americans, you mentioned who 40% have just avoided altogether. How do we? At some point.
So the data is, and I want to be really clear. Yeah. So that they all the time, sometimes or often, and sometimes it's just like a specific topic. So they'll be like, I avoid this. I avoid all news about climate change, or I avoid all news about criminal justice. Right. And that's really interesting because it turns out that your political ideology influences which topics you're inclined to avoid. Totally another story, but it's all just to say that we are consumers making choices, and we have the ability to make different choices that can affect the outcome for ourselves, that can help us feel more empowered.
So you and I have tried to figure out ways to do that. Is there a suggestion you have for the average person who goes, I do want to be informed, but I don't want the anxiety that you and I have talked about? Where would I start to kind of begin to unpack what I'm sensing and feeling and fearing to get to the point where I can consume news again in a way that's healthy?
Well, I'm a big fan of experiencing some success in order to boost your confidence. So what I often recommend is, first of all, is take control, like really take the reins here. Pick one topic that matters to you, one question, one issue, whatever it is. Pick the thing that's sort of popping for you in this moment. And make your news consumption only about that. Don't try to drink from the water hose of all the other stuff that's happening. And don't spend your time scrolling through headlines, because that's only just going to jerk around your emotions. Those headlines exist to make you feel things so that you will click and stay on the page. Okay. That is not where the nuance is embedded. I promise you, I've written headlines. It's very hard to get nuance into a good headline. So what I recommend is pick a topic that you really care about and maybe spend a whole week on that topic. Read one article per day from a different source about that topic. So I'm talking about spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But here's the kicker, okay? You're going to pick the topic. You're going to pick a source. I recommend choosing from a range of sources. I mean, you could even do this by using one of those newsletters, right? And be like, here's a source on the left, here's a source on the right. So today I'm going to read this one, and tomorrow I'm going to read that one, okay? So break it down. You're going to spend 15, 20 minutes, and you're going to read that article. But here's the thing. You're going to read every single word. When is the last time, Keith, you read every single word of a news article?
It's been a while.
It is rare. All right. And it's not, and it is because, and I do this all the time. I get 3 or 4 paragraphs in. I'm like, all right, I get the idea. I know what there is to know about this. Or, yeah, I don't really agree with this. This is kind of annoying me. Or, I don't think that these sources are credible. Whatever it is, right? Or this is too complicated. I'm having a hard time understanding it, right? We don't read every single word. But as a journalist, I can tell you that there is a reason that every single word exists in that story, because they had to get it to a specific word count or a specific amount of time. Every single word I choose in the podcast that I do is intentional. And I agonize over that. And I include, and oftentimes the nuance, the complexity, if it exists in a story, is not going to be in the first paragraph or the headline. It's going to be much further down in the story. And so the practice of reading every single word is both, it's going to allow me to get to stuff that I wouldn't have read, and that's where I might start to see the complexity and feel surprised, which is part of the sense of empowerment for me. Instead of just the like, oh, of course the Democrat says this and the Republican says this and tell me something I don't know, right? Hopefully there will be something further down in the story that will make me go, oh, well, that's weird. I never thought of that before. But it's also strengthening my muscle, my ability to stay curious when certainty wants to sort of take the reins of my consciousness. Because when I feel like I know everything there is to know about something, then I'm a lot less likely to be open to the fact that I have blind spots, which makes me it makes it a lot easier for me to cast judgment upon other people, making assumptions about the way that they're behaving, because I have this blind spot, but I haven't taken the time to consider that blind spot. So it just drives polarization. So by making the effort to read every single word, we practice engaging in a more thoughtful way, and then answering, and then noticing when I start to feel bored, noticing when I'm starting to feel annoyed, noticing when I'm getting a little confused, and wondering, is it because this is not aligning with my worldview here? Am I using shortcuts in my mind that make it so this is hard for me to follow because I want things to be simple, because that's how our brains work? I find that can be really empowering, and it's a great place to start. See what happens. See how much. I bet you'll have a hard time just reading only one article a day, because once you start digging deep into a topic, you start to have a much more nuanced understanding. You start to see what you didn't realize you didn't know. You start to see some of the complexity. And then I'm just like, let's go down a rabbit hole. I'm fascinated, and I want to talk about this with people in my life. And I want to, maybe watch a documentary about this. And that for me feels empowering. That is exciting. It's not depressing or anxiety inducing.
So I want to talk to you about something I'm interested in. I know you have a podcast, and I'm curious about some of the guests, maybe the most interesting conversation you've had on your podcast, maybe with somebody you disagree with or you thought you disagree with. What made that conversation so unique and empowering?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked about this. I don't have a favorite guest or a most memorable episode, right? But what I do have is frequently because the whole goal is to go in looking to have our worldview shaken just a little bit. I often, when I have a bias, I always try to acknowledge that to the listener, so that they understand, sort of where my head was at. So one, for example, it was an episode that we did about transparency in government. So, we were trying to understand, what's going on when governments or politicians are like, no, we're not going to release our emails, or we're not going to make these particular documents open to the public, right? I'm a journalist. I will always fall on the side of more openness, please. And I get really frustrated when public officials are like, no, you're not going to get that information. I'm like, you did it on the public's dollar. It's related to how you made decisions that affect people's lives. And the government, we have rules called freedom of information rules and laws, both on the state and the federal level, that say that we should be able to have access to public information. And if you're going to exclude yourself from that, then what am I to assume other than you're trying to do something shady? And this is about your own protecting your tail. It's about corruption. Okay, so I came into this episode with a real strong bias, as I think many journalists would have, toward openness is always better for democracy. The more open, the better. Well, in the course of this episode, I ended up speaking with, several politicians who I actually respected as individuals, who seemed to me like they weren't trying to just milk, the public dollar or do things that were shady, and that they also expressed that they were a little conflicted about when to close things, when to open things. Okay, so for me that softened me just a little bit, because I'm like, all right, well, they're not just the mustache twirling villains out to like hide their shady dealings from the public. All right. And then I talked to a political scientist who explained that something that had never occurred to me before, which is that when you say something on the record in an open environment, when politicians are expected to do all of their negotiation and in public on the record, they are less likely to change their mind, to negotiate, to bend, because they have been forced to take a stand publicly. And so there is a possibility that by pushing everything to openness as much as we have, where everything happens on C-SPAN and we want to see all the emails and anything that they communicate with one another behind closed doors might eventually end up in the public. If you go too far with that, it's actually, to some extent, openness can fuel polarization. And I am a big complainer when it comes to polarization, how terrible it is that Congress won't compromise and all they want to do is dig in on their own side. And demanding openness at every turn can make that worse, which was a real shocker to me, because I then had to realize I had to soften my stance on that issue. By the end of that episode, I was like, oh, okay. Sometimes maybe it's okay to let them go into a closed room, work things out, not insist that people take a stand at the very beginning, draw that line in the sand. Maybe we could get to more, I'm not advocating for smoke-filled rooms and darkness, right? But also I'm realizing that that I had way more certainty about this issue than was actually warranted. So that's just one example. I mean, this happens to me all the time. We intentionally go into these episodes looking for perspectives that are going to shake us a little bit. And whenever I have a pretty strong perspective on something, almost inevitably I come out a little softened. It's rare that people will completely 180 their perspective, but definitely I'll come away realizing that is uncomfortable for me and I need to now incorporate that into my worldview. And next time I see a news headline, a story about my lawmakers who are trying to revise the Public Records Act to make their emails harder to access or whatever through public records requests, that I need to at least investigate further and not be so quick to just assume that they're trying to hide malfeasance from the public.
Now, see, you've made me rethink that issue myself, and now I have to also soften my stance, because I was kind of happy with my own stance. I think that's the problem, too, is we get very comfortable with our stance, and when someone challenges it and gives us good reasons why these things might be in place, we tend to not be very trusting. It's hard because so much news makes us distrustful of the media and the government and the military that anytime those things come up, we just distrust them automatically out of hand. And so I'm curious, as a journalist, how would you suggest that journalism rebuild its reputation that's been, I think, hampered and hindered in the last few years?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that, and there's actually a great organization called Trusting News is the name of the organization. And it's journalists who are working to help other journalists rebuild the public trust. Because you're right, public trust in institutions in general, and the media is a part of that, is at or near historic lows. And the media has been complicit in that process. Okay. Some of it is because we're too broadly defining the media. When people say the media is so biased, I'm like, let's be specific here. Okay. Are you talking about national cable news outlets? Are you talking about your local newspaper? Are you talking about some random website or social media account? Like, what do you mean by the media? Let's stop using broad brush, assumptions and be specific. Now, I do think that for me, what do I look for in a news outlet? What do I look for in news outlets that I want to trust, that I feel like are more credible? And you were seeing a lot more of this happening, to be honest. The news journalists, national newspapers, local newspapers, well-sourced public radio stations, even and cable news and network news. We're seeing some of these strategies being adopted. But I think it's really important. Well, first of all, you want to see that when they make mistakes, because mistakes happen, because journalists are human, that when they make mistakes, you want to see that they that they correct them quickly, loudly, publicly, and work hard to make sure that that's also, they're not going to bury it down or sort of do it on a separate kind of page at the bottom of wherever where it's hard to see. Like, they're going to own those and do that very openly. And it's that, I think, is an important part of building trust. But the consumer needs to acknowledge that needs to recognize that that is a sign of strength and not weakness. Because if you're inclined to think that anytime a newspaper gets it wrong, that they can no longer be trusted, then henceforth and forever on anything that they report, then you're throwing the entire baby out with the bathwater. So it's important, I think being transparent also about their process. I think that anytime news journalists use unnamed sources, they need to be very explicit about why they're doing that and the ways that is potentially undermining or weakens whatever story they're trying to tell, and not pretend like it's more, because they need to be, because anytime you're an unnamed source, we don't know, we can't judge as the public. And you're telling me I should just trust you, the journalist? But if I don't already have trust in you, like, show me your work. Let's be as clear as possible. I think that they should name sources as often as possible and lean into that kind of reporting as much as possible. The other thing I also would say is that I think more and more we're seeing news outlets, well, not more and more, but in some instances we are seeing news outlets being very clear about acknowledging their biases. For example, the New York Times has a new, like, you can click through into the bio of the individual reporter that wrote the story, and they have a personal statement in which they'll identify sort of why they do this work and kind of where they've come from. And sometimes you'll see, like, if they have certain identities that they're also reporting on, maybe they're a member of the same church that they're reporting on, or maybe they're reporting on LGBTQ issues and they also identify as queer, whatever it is. Like, those, I think that those kinds of things, we need to, the media, the journalists need to do better at communicating to the public that there's no such thing as complete objectivity, that everything is told through a lens, and that that's okay. And that the best we can do is be very clear about what might potentially be affecting the way that we're telling these stories, so that it's all out in the open for you. But it also means that you, as the reader or the listener or the viewer, has to then take that information and do some work on your own.
Those are all very good points. I like that. That would definitely help to break down some of the barriers that are there, some of the distrust that's there. Because I think we see the biases, but if they're not open and honest about them, we just go, why are you hiding your biases? I think I just saw a reporter was on television and talking about CNN, for example, and saying, hey, we're an unbiased news, and the audience all broke into laughter. So, I think they have to own up to the fact that sometimes what their perception of themselves and what the public thinks are not quite in line.
Yeah, I would really love for us to kind of redefine, and anytime I get up on my soapbox, it's about this. It's about the nature of bias and how there's more bias than just political bias, but that bias exists in every single, story that you're going to tell, and that we just need to do a much better job of being very clear about that so that you can be an informed consumer. I think we've done ourselves a disservice as journalists and as news media outlets in sort of leading listeners and viewers and readers to believe that they can expect the complete and unvarnished objective interpretation of any issue.
That's very true. I love to ask my guests this question. What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, gosh. I don't think about my legacy. I mean, that's terrible, right? I just hope that they don't say terrible things about me when I die. But, because I have a lot of shortcomings and I'm not the easiest person to be around sometimes. But when it comes to this particular issue, when I think about my journalistic legacy, what do I want to feel like at the end of my career I was able to accomplish? I hope to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
I love that. And as we wrap this up, what do you want people to take away to become better citizens and kinder neighbors?
I think that I hope that people recognize that we have a lot of power and that we have so many great resources, but that it's really about making choices and choosing intentionally to expose ourselves to viewpoints we disagree with. because that's where we get to more clarity about our own views. So I think we become better at advocating for what we want. We become kinder neighbors when we feel empathy for perspectives we haven't heard before. But we only get those things if we engage with open curiosity, with perspectives that oftentimes we want to just shut down because we disagree or because they challenge us, which is actually the whole point of my podcasts, right? So Top of Mind is an opportunity to hear a range of perspectives on an issue, including perspectives that will challenge you. That's my guarantee. You will hear something that challenges you, but you'll also hear stuff you agree with. And you'll be left with the ability to make better decisions for yourself and feel new empathy. And then Uncomfy is such a fun way. It's a video podcast, as well as audio, to hear real people telling us about a time when they did this. And man, it was hard, but here's why they're glad they did it. Here are the strategies they deployed. It's a muscle we have to learn to strengthen. And so I hope that people come away from the work that I do really understanding that hopelessness comes from a sense of powerlessness. But then when we take control of our media consumption and we will ourselves to engage with challenging perspectives, we become empowered and empathetic. And that's how we become better citizens and kinder neighbors.
So Julie, where can people find you and connect with you on social media?
Absolutely. So on social media, people can connect with me. I am Julie Rose, and there's an underscore between each of those words. But the easiest thing is just to go to any podcast app, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever you use, and look for Top of Mind with Julie Rose or Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. Both of those podcasts you'll be able to find really easily. And I'd love to have you follow and be in touch.
Well, thank you for what you do and for the energy you bring to this sphere, because I think it's so important that we find a way to stay informed yet stay hopeful, because I think once we're no longer hopeful, the anxiety that we all have building up inside of us bubbles over. So I like the fact that we can be informed and not lose our minds in the process. So congratulations on what you're doing and blessings on what you do.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for having me today and for the work that you do.
Do you know that most entrepreneurs hit a revenue ceiling and have no idea why? They're working harder, spending more money, running more ads, but revenue stays flat. My friend Dr. Noah St. John calls this the invisible break. He's giving our listeners a free revenue ceiling audit to help you see what's really holding you back. You'll get a free 30-day membership to Noah Bot, giving you access to Dr. Noah's 30 years of experience to help you reach your next level. But hurry, because there's only 50 available this month. So if you're tired of being stuck at the same revenue level and want to finally break through, get your free revenue ceiling audit at drnoahvault.com in the affiliate link that'll be listed in the show notes.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at @BKeithHaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin. Thanks again and tune in next time.